Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of videos looking at the key institutional actors in American foreign policy. In this video, we're going to look at the role of the bureaucracy in foreign policy decision making. The U.S. federal bureaucracy is complex, and each agency and organization can often develop its own standard operating procedures, institutional cultures, goals, and missions. Not surprisingly, the bureaucracy plays an important role in foreign policy decision making, and it's that role that we're going to explore in this video, so let's get to it. The growth of the federal bureaucracy took place in four broad stages or waves. The first was the New Deal of the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt sought to expand the social safety net and address the Great Depression. These efforts led to a variety of programs, most notably the Social Security Administration and a host of public works projects designed to provide employment for out-of-work Americans. World War II further exacerbated this trend. The second was the era of the creation of the national security state in the context of the Cold War. The most notable example of this was the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, which created the National Military Establishment, the forerunner to the Department of Defense as we know it today, headed by the Secretary of Defense and comprised of the departments of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. It also established the Central Intelligence Agency and created the National Security Council to advise the President on foreign policy and national security issues. The third was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, which dramatically expanded domestic social spending, declaring a war on poverty, and expanding spending on education, healthcare, and social welfare. And finally, after the September 11th terror attacks, a renewed emphasis on national security led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as a cabinet-level position, and the Intelligence Reform and Prevention of Terrorism Act led to the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, designed to overcome some of the historical fragmentation within the intelligence community. Through all these eras, the size of the federal bureaucracy expanded dramatically. The federal bureaucracy is massive. When the United States was founded, the government consisted of just three small departments, State, War, and Treasury, with fewer than about 1,000 employees. Today, around 3 million people are employed across 15 major departments and hundreds of federal agencies and organizations, with total budgets in excess of $2 trillion per year. Given the focus of this course, we are primarily interested in the foreign policy bureaucracy, that is, the parts of the federal bureaucracy that deal with issues in foreign policy. It can be a difficult line to draw sometimes. While the Departments of State and Defense have clear foreign policy objectives, others like the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Treasury play important roles despite their apparent domestic focus. At the federal level, the bureaucracy can be divided into four broad categories. Cabinet departments, which are the 15 departments generally headed by political appointees, mostly secretaries, and are directly accountable to the president. In the foreign policy context, the most important of these are the departments of State, Defense, Treasury, Homeland Security, and Energy. Independent executive agencies are not located within any cabinet department, but are headed by appointees who report directly to the president. This tends to give the agencies a degree of autonomy, but can also foster animosity between specific agencies and departments which feel that the agencies are creeping into their issue areas. Major independent executive agencies operating in the foreign policy sphere include the Central Intelligence Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and others. Independent regulatory agencies make rules governing specific sectors of the economy, but are supposed to operate relatively independently from the other executive departments. The theory is that they should be insulated against political interference in their operation. The most well-known example of these is the Federal Reserve System, which regulates the U.S. money supply, effectively maintaining the value of the U.S. dollar. Finally, government corporations operate independently and are intended to run in a business-like manner, though often providing services which would not be profitable for the private sector to provide. The most important examples of government corporations include the U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak. In addition to these formal organizations, we should also include the Executive Office of the President, which includes the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and others. The leaders of the major agencies and departments are usually the closest advisors to the President. The leaders of major agencies and departments are usually the closest advisors to the President. This photo of the Obama administration White House Situation Room during Operation Neptune Spear, the raid that ultimately killed Osama bin Laden, illustrates that. Who's sitting around the table here? Of course, President Obama and Vice President Biden are there, as are Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. General Webb maintained communications with operational forces on the ground during the raid. White House Chief of Staff Bill Daley is president, as are the Director of National Intelligence, the President's National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, and the Vice President's National Security Advisor. General Mike Mullen, Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Brennan, President Obama's Assistant for Homeland Security, and Audrey Thompson, the Director of Counterterrorism. While the federal bureaucracy is intended to help provide advice and to carry out the orders and directions of the president, the huge size of the bureaucracy can also create challenges. As the photo of the White House Situation Room during the bin Laden raid shows, only a handful of the highest-ranking advisors have direct access to the president, and only the most important decisions can be made by the president. The vast majority of decisions are actually made by bureaucrats operating in their day-to-day roles at much lower levels. Such decisions are usually informed by presidential priorities only in the broadest sense, and instead they rely on standard operating procedures, the established or prescribed methods for the routine performance of bureaucratic decision-making. These standard operating procedures can create a sense of bureaucratic inertia, where decisions keep being made as they've always been made, making change difficult. Policymaking can also be obstructed by bureaucratic infighting, particularly between the separate bureaucratic agencies with similar mandates or missions. Bureaucracies sometimes view themselves as in competition with agencies for scarce resources in terms of funding or personnel or access to decision makers. We'll return to this idea in a later video. Internal tensions within specific agencies or departments can also emerge, particularly between the career civil servants who are responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the organization and the political appointees named to lead the agencies. In recent years, this problem's been particularly pronounced in the Department of State, where a series of secretaries of state have been blamed for undermining morale of the civil services within the department, leading to waves of departures and early retirements. The professional civil servants, who often develop policy expertise in very specific areas over time, can sometimes resent political appointees whose primary qualification is loyalty to the president rather than expertise in the specific agency's mandated mission area, and political appointees can sometimes resent the resistance of career employees to the changes that they hope to make in the agencies. All of this can serve to undermine institutional effectiveness. And finally, the structure of the bureaucracy itself also facilitates a gatekeeping role, limiting communication between the various layers of the federal bureaucracy. Traditionally, this role was most clearly played by the Chief of Staff, through whom much of the communication between the President and their advisors flowed, but it also applies to the federal bureaucracy more broadly. The State Department, for example, employs about 24,000 people, with an estimated 45,000 additional local employees worldwide. Very few Foreign Service officers will have direct access to the Secretary of State, and even fewer will have access to other high-level decision makers like the President. Instead, information flows through gatekeepers at various levels who will decide what information to pass up and will report back down the chain of command. The gatekeeping function becomes particularly clear when you consider the people closest to the President. While there's millions of federal employees, the 2,000 or so who occupy the executive office of the president are much closer to the president than the others. The president is responsible for appointments, with confirmation by the Senate, of thousands of individuals into the bureaucracy: the secretaries, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and so on. These appointees are generally knowledgeable about the portfolio for which they're responsible, share the president's worldview and ideological outlook, and are loyal to the president. They're often recruited from the presidential election campaign, but they have to rely on thousands of professional civil servants to be effective. Think about it in this context. The Department of State is headed by the Secretary of State, and directly under the Secretary of State are 6 undersecretaries, each responsible for a specific mandate. For example, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs oversees all of the regional bureaus and the bilateral policy issues, while the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security Affairs deals with questions of proliferation, arms control, regional defense agreements, security assistance, and so on. Each Undersecretary oversees and is advised by multiple Assistant Secretaries. For example, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs oversees 8 Assistant Secretaries, each of which is responsible for a specific regional bureau. For example, the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs or the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and so on. Each of the Assistant Secretaries are supported by Deputy Assistant Secretaries, and so on. And nearly every federal department is structured in a similar kind of way. Arguably, a handful of presidential appointments are the most important presidential advisors in foreign affairs. This obviously includes the National Security Advisor, more formally known as the Special Advisor to the President for National Security Affairs. The National Security Advisor is responsible for chairing the National Security Council and is supposed to serve as the principal foreign policy advisor to the president. In theory, the National Security Advisor serves as an honest broker, providing unfiltered advice and policy options to the president. The position is part of the White House staff and does not require senatorial confirmation. Among the more well-known National Security Advisors have been McGeorge Bundy, who held the position during the Kennedy administration, Henry Kissinger, who served as National Security Advisor for both President Nixon and President Ford, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who served in the Carter administration, Colin Powell, who served during the Bush administration, and Condoleezza Rice, the first woman to occupy this position and also serving during the Bush administration. The Secretary of State heads the U.S. State Department, one of the 3 original federal departments, and the primary agency responsible for U.S. foreign policy and international relations. In other countries, the equivalent position is the Foreign Minister, who usually heads the Foreign Ministry. The Secretary of State is one of the highest-ranking members of the President's cabinet and is 4th in line in presidential succession after the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tem of the Senate. The Secretary of State supervises the Foreign Service, oversees immigration policy, and advises the President on foreign affairs. Well-known Secretaries of State have included Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, John Kerry, and John Foster Dulles. The Secretary of Defense oversees the U.S. Armed Forces, operating as second in command to the President. In other countries, the position is often referred to as the Defense Minister. The position is appointed by the President and is confirmed by the Senate, and is responsible for providing military advice to the President. Historically, the position's been occupied by a civilian, and any appointment of a military officer to the position requires special dispensation from Congress. Before the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, the War Department, as it was known from 1871 through 1945, was headed by the Secretary of War, and both the Department of the Army and the Department of Navy were cabinet-level offices. After the 1947 Act, the military was reorganized and the position of Secretary of Defense was created to oversee all U.S. military forces. Nevertheless, the Department of Defense is considered one of the 3 original federal departments, along with State and Treasury. Well-known Secretaries of State have included Robert McNamara, who was the longest-serving Defense Secretary, occupying the position for both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, Donald Rumsfeld, who served as Secretary of Defense under the Ford and Bush administrations, and who controversially oversaw U.S. policy in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, Dick Cheney, who served as Defense Secretary under George H.W. Bush's administration and would later serve as George W. Bush's Vice President, and Lloyd Austin, who was named Defense Secretary under the Biden administration and was the first person of color to serve in that position. To date, no woman has ever served as Defense Secretary. The Director of National Intelligence position was created by the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 and was intended to oversee all intelligence operations. The success of the September 11th terror attacks was attributed in part to the failure of the American intelligence community to successfully piece together clues that might have successfully warned against the attack. Congress and the Bush administration believed that a cabinet-level position overseeing all intelligence operations might be better positioned to advise the president and warn of future attacks. That argument's been criticized, and the infighting between the Defense Intelligence Agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, and other intelligence groups have undermined the effectiveness of the position. John Negroponte served as the first Director of National Intelligence. He served for 4 years under the Bush administration and was widely credited for creating the current structure of the Office of the Director. James Clapper was the longest-serving DNI, occupying the position throughout most of the Obama administration, and Avril Haines was appointed by President Biden to the position in 2021, becoming the first woman to hold the post. Until 2005, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible, at least in theory, for coordinating all national intelligence efforts and for serving as the primary presidential advisor on intelligence questions. The position was also a cabinet-level officer. However, after the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, the position was reduced in stature in favor of the Director of National Intelligence. The Special Assistant to the President for Economic Affairs, also known as the National Economic Advisor, was a position created in the early 1990s by the Clinton administration in an effort to elevate economic policymaking to the same level as national security policy in the cabinet. The structure was explicitly modeled on the National Security Council structure. The National Economic Advisor is the president's primary economic policy advisor and helps to implement the president's economic agenda. This position shouldn't be confused with the White House Council of Economic Advisors, which was established in the 1940s to provide a nonpartisan economic research avenue to the president. The mandate of the National Economic Advisor transcends the domestic-international divide, particularly as so-called intermestic issues have grown in importance. The Secretary of the Treasury heads the U.S. Treasury Department, the third of the 3 original federal offices. The Treasury Secretary advises the presidents on all matters related to federal taxes and revenues, the banking system, the national debt, and matters of fiscal policy. Because of the central role of the U.S. dollar in the global economy and the dependence of the U.S. economy on broader international structures, the Treasury Department plays a central role in foreign policy decision-making. Among the most important Treasury secretaries are Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary and helped to establish the U.S. monetary system, James Baker and Nicholas Brady, who served respectively in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations and helped to oversee the establishment of market-based economies in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and Janet Yellen, who was appointed by President Biden in 2021 and became the first woman to hold the role of Treasury Secretary after already having been the first woman to hold the position of Chair of the Federal Reserve. Finally, the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff oversee the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the body comprised of the most senior uniformed commanders of the Defense Department, that is, the service chiefs of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and most recently the Space Force, as well as the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Since the passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986, the Joint Chiefs of Staff do not have operational command authority, but instead serve as principal military advisors to the civilian leadership of the U.S. government, including the Secretary of Defense, the Homeland Security Council, the National Security Council, and the President. So that concludes our overview of the foreign policy bureaucracy of the United States. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.